a recent article by Bert Crabb was published in Leadership Journal that spoke of a short span of great tragedy off of the coast of New Jersey in the commercial shipping industry. In the span of just 13 days, 3 ships were lost at sea. In just 13 days, 10 lives in all were lost in those 3 accidents. And in an industry that's known to be dangerous, I mean, this is just over the top to have 3 ships lost in just 13 days, especially when you consider the circumstances. That all 3 ships none of them experienced a hull breach, so they didn't hit anything. They didn't have a hole in the ship. All 3 were captained by experienced pilots with at least 10 years of experience each, and all 3 were very close to home, all heading for the same port, all within 15 miles of port. And so you have to wonder what happened to these ships that made them go down in such a short amount of time. Well, 2 of the 3 ships they discovered were overloaded. They had too much cargo. All 3 of the ships were clamming ships. And I don't know if you know much about clamming, but a clamming trap is about yay high, and empty it's about 300 pounds. But when it's full, it can weigh up to like 1.5 tons or 3,000 pounds. And 2 of these ships had 10 extra full traps of clams, or about 15 tons more than they were supposed to be carrying. So you got to imagine what would make a captain take on an extra 30,000 pounds onto his boat over and above what the safety spec said. So in the investigation, interviewers were interviewing captains in the area and saying, why would a knowledgeable, trained, experienced captain make the decision to completely ignore the safety specs on his boat and overload his boat with an extra 30,000 pounds? And the answer that kept coming back were kind of quizzical looks and shrugged shoulders from all these captains, were basically saying, why wouldn't he? It's the industry practice. That's what we do. We overload our ships because we make more money. Now, the 3rd ship was lost not because they were overloaded, but because they were out of balance. They were technically within the weight limits, but they had been carrying their weight improperly. And what had happened is they had taken these full clam traps and stacked them on top of empty clam traps, so that the weight was on top rather than below the water line where it needed to be, and so there was no ballast. So the crew on that ship had kind of ignored and violated one of the key principles of shipping. The ship has to be heavier below the water line than above. And so because they didn't get the heaviest, most important stuff in the ship first, the ship was vulnerable. Because it was out of balance, not even the most experienced captain or crew would be able to kind of keep it afloat if the right storm hit, which it did. We've been in this series for the last 4 weeks called Margin, and the need for margin is something that most of us can resonate with, because we all live in a culture that kind of baits us to live to the very edge in every area of our lives. We're baited to live to the edge in our schedules and our time and just fill it all up with as much as we possibly can. We're baited to live to the edge financially and just spend everything that we make. We're baited to live to the very edge relationally and just fill up all of our time with friends and emotions and all that. We're baited to live to the very edge morally. Just get as close to the line as you possibly can. And so we've been talking about how to create margin in these different areas of our lives. And what we've seen is that margin is something that God wants for us, and it's something that He has kind of programmed into society from the very beginning. And when He created the world, one of the first gifts He gave us was the gift of margin of time. When He gave us this gift called the Sabbath. And He said, every 7th day, I want you to stop your activity, stop your doing, stop your going, stop your working. And in essence, the principle was, you work for 6 days and you trust me for 7 days of provision. It's a gift that God gave us right from the beginning. And then also we talked last week about how to have financial margin, and this gift God gave us called the tithe, and how God didn't intend for us to consume everything He gave us. It's not all for us, but it's to be used for His purposes. And so how He instituted this thing called the tithe, and the first 10% He gives us is intended to be used for His purposes. And again, the principle is that we give Him, we live on 90% or 80% or 70% or some percent under 100%, but we trust Him for 100% of our provision. We create margin in our lives, and we trust Him that when we don't go to the very edge, we trust Him to provide for all of our needs, whatever they may be. Now, today we're going to move to another area of where a lot of us need margin in our lives, and I'm going to be treading on some dangerous territory culturally, and this could be an emotional thing. I don't know, but I'm going to go there anyway. We're going to talk about the family. All right? Margin in the family. As a matter of fact, kids, our word of the day today is family or families. You count how many times you hear me say one of those words, and take that number into the foyer afterwards, and I think we'll have a treat for you. Let me just begin by saying I think we have some amazing families at Newday. Strong families, wise parents, and I am the product of many of the families in this congregation. I am the parent I am for a large degree because of many of the families in this congregation. When we first came to this church in the year 2000, when we were down in Franktown, our boys were 2 and 6, and so we were right in the heart of things. We had a toddler and a first grader, and we were still trying to figure things out. And we learned so much from a lot of the parents that were part of Newday and how you parent and how you relate to each other in marriage. And so we are who we are in a large degree because of that. And we are so grateful to be able to do life with great people. Today we're going to be talking about families and kind of in our culture. And families are kind of in crisis in our culture. And all of us are shaped by and influenced by our culture. And so if we're going to figure out how to have margin in our families, we're going to have to figure out how to be counterculture. We're going to have to figure out how to be able to go upstream on some things. Because again, families are in crisis. Marriages are in crisis. Kids are suffering. As we were putting together this HIV caregiver kit event that we're having in 2 weeks at the Pace Center, we were working with the social workers in our schools trying to identify kids who are really suffering, who may really need to be a part of an event where they're serving needs outside of themselves. And we were talking with one of our counselors in one of our schools, and we asked, do you think you could identify 50 kids in your school of about 1,000 who you would identify as really suffering, really hurting, going through the kind of needs that would necessitate them to come to an event like this? And she said, I think we only have 50 who wouldn't need to come. And her comment was somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but the point is clear. Kids are hurting because families are hurting right here in our community and in our culture. And to a large degree, families are suffering for the same reason those 3 ships went down off of the coast of New Jersey. One of the reasons families suffer so much is because we are overloaded. We are just packing too much in. Right? We carry too much. We've gotten to the point where we have eliminated any margin from our families. I mean, we spend more time at work than we ever have in our lives or ever have in history. Right? And at the same time that parents are working more than ever, kids are doing more activities than they've ever done before. And so what happens? Our kids have school and sports and dance and gymnastics and swim team and the scouting club and homework and then throw in church. And so we leave office early to get our kids and drive our kids where they need to go, and then we watch them do what they're doing, but the whole time we're kind of checking email and answering phone calls, and then when that activity is done, we pile them in the car, we go through the drive-through lane to grab some fast food, and we all have something to eat, and then we get home, and we drop the kids off so they can do their homework and study until they collapse in bed at 10:30, and then we either go back to the office or we work at home to finish up the things we didn't finish at the office until we finally collapse somewhere around midnight, and then we wake up the next day and we do it all again. And while we don't all sync, or we don't all sync immediately, when families we know do go down because we've made ourselves vulnerable to circumstances that we should be able to withstand because of the lack of margin. When families go down and we ask each other, how could we have let that happen? Or how could they have let that happen? How could they have loaded so much into their family knowing how dangerous it is? We all just kind of shrug and say, that's just the way it is. That's the way our culture is. You got to keep up. You got to fill your schedule. Everyone's busy. Or many of us are leading our families the way the third ship loaded their cargo. We live out of balance. We may not have too much, but we're not getting the right stuff in. We're not getting the best stuff in first to create ballast, to create weight underneath the waterline so that when the waves come and the storms come, we're able to kind of navigate. What is driving us to live lives that are overloaded and out of balance? Because if I were to ask you, what is the point of your family, or what is your goal as parents? Most of us would probably say, well, our goal as parents is to raise our kids to love and follow Jesus and to be well-adjusted and have good character, but primarily the whole spiritual piece, to love and follow Christ. And if you're a Christian, you'd say your primary role as a mom or a dad is the spiritual development of our kids. But if we were to step back and just kind of study the way we live or our culture lives, and try to determine what the real goal or real purpose is, based not on our words, not on our intentions, but how we kind of schedule our time, we may discover a completely different purpose for our parenting. And maybe we think our purpose is just to keep the kids busy, or to give them every opportunity we didn't have when we were kids. That's one I think a lot. I just want to give them every opportunity that I didn't have when I was a kid. Or maybe we think that we want our kids to be able to keep up with the other kids, or maybe we want our kids to have great family memories when they grow up, and that's the thing that's driving us. We just want them to look back with fondness on their time in our family, or we just want our kids to like us when they become adults. And as we talked about week one of the most primary underlying factors that drives us to live without margin is the emotion of fear. And we may say, well, I don't have any fear in my family, and maybe it's true for some of us, maybe not all of us, or maybe we're managing our fear so well with busyness we don't even experience it. But as we start to think about creating margin in our families and slowing down and pulling back, then the fear starts to surface. Well, if I do that, I'm just afraid that my kids will fall behind. Or I'm afraid I'll fall behind, or I'll miss something. Or my kids will miss something, or they won't develop like the other kids, or they won't have the same experiences, or they'll become resentful, or I'm afraid. And here's a fear that many of us maybe don't think about, we don't operate from here, but I'm wondering how true it may be for some of us, that if we were to step back and look, we realize that we're being driven by another fear, and that is, I am afraid that when my children grow up, they won't like me. And I very much want them to like me. And so I don't want them to resent me. I don't want to say no. I don't want them to miss anything. And so we just go, and we go, and we go, because I'm trying to win their approval. We all know that's no way to raise a family. And it's no way to lead a family. So we need to just step back and just remember, what did God say was the primary purpose of a family? What is my God-given role as a mom, as a dad? And then, how do I get those most important things in first so I can begin to create some ballast in my family, put more weight below the waterline so that when the inevitable storms come, we're able to withstand, and make sure that I get the most important things in first so that I can start to put the other things in, and as I put the other things in, I know the most important things are getting done. So, I don't know, maybe in case I've lost anybody or you don't know where we're going today, let me just say, and if you have to leave early, you can kind of know where we're going. All I want to say today is that if we want to have margin in our families, the most important thing we can do is to get the most important things in first. If we get these one or two important things in first, make sure we prioritize these things, it will give us a proper weighting and balance in our family to have ballast, weight below the waterline, so that when storms blow, we'll be okay. But more than that, as we start to put in other activities, we will naturally have margin because these other important things are in to kind of guide us to make decisions on what should and shouldn't be included in our families. Now, I'm going to be speaking to parents with kids primarily today, but I'm hoping if you're single or if you're an empty nester that we all can hopefully get some principles, because this principle is true for all of us. Get the most important things in first. You're going to have that strong foundation. But if you have a Bible, find the book of Ephesians, and then find chapter 6. What we're going to find the Bible has is two primary purposes for a family. You get these two things in, you're probably going to have good margin in your family. We're going to find them in Ephesians chapter 6. Now, Ephesians is considered to be one of the most beautiful and theologically deep books in the Bible. It was written by the Apostle Paul toward the end of his life, probably 62 A.D. He was sitting in a prison in Rome when he wrote this particular letter to the church in Ephesus. And it's just this beautiful theological treatise. It's 6 chapters. The first 3 chapters are all pretty much theological in nature, talking about our standing in Christ, that before the world was created, God chose us to adopt us as sons and daughters, that we're saved by grace through faith. It's a gift, not by works, that we are all heirs with Christ, that we have peace with God, that we have an eternal home waiting for us. That's the first 3 chapters. And then the last 3 chapters of the book are all very practical, and they talk about, well, this is what life should look like based on the first 3 chapters. Because We have been saved by grace through faith because we have been adopted as sons and daughters of God, because we have peace with God, because we have an eternal home waiting for us. This is therefore how we should live. And right in the heart of that practical treatise in chapters 4 through 6, we come across one of the most beautiful writings on what it means to be a husband and a wife and on the marriage relationship. And Paul is comparing it to the church and Christ and salvation, and husbands and wives and love and respect. And all. It's just this beautiful 12-verse kind of treatise on marriage. And then we come to chapter 6. And in chapter 6, the first 4 verses are directed to families. And again, in light of the fact that we have been adopted as sons and daughters of God, in light of the fact that we've been saved through the blood of Christ by grace, in light of the fact that we have peace with God and we have an eternal home waiting for us in heaven, what should our families look like? And Paul's just going to give us 4 verses. And really, this is it in the New Testament when it comes to parenting. I mean, there's not a whole lot on how to run a family, but Paul, from a prison, in his wise old age, knowing what he knows, knowing Christ the way he does, knowing what he's seen in families, he says, I'm going to give you 2 things. And if you get these 2 things, you're probably going to have a solid family. What are those 2 important truths? Ephesians chapter 6, beginning in verse 1, this is what Paul writes. He says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise." I got all the parents with me. They're like, "Are you listening, kids?" I mean, for the first time in church. Are you listening? "Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth." So Paul has just finished his long, beautiful treatise on what it means to be a husband, what it means to be a wife, how to have a good marriage relationship. And now, as he turns to the family, he addresses his counsel to kids. He says, "Kids, honor and respect your parents." And he makes an allusion to the 5th of the 10 commandments. And he points out the fact that this is the first of the 10 commandments that comes with a promise. That if you will honor and respect your parents, most likely you will live long and flourish on the earth. I just wonder, does that have anything to do with that thing that we say when our kids are disobedient? You know, I brought you into this world, I could take you out, right? I mean, maybe that's what Paul is referring to. You're going to have a long life if you obey me. I don't know. Probably not. But I find it interesting that in a culture that often gets this backwards, that this is where Paul chooses to start in his instruction to families. And his instruction is basically this: children, honor your parents. Children, respect your parents. Children, obey your parents. And I find it interesting because we live in a culture that tends to get this backwards. We live in a culture where it seems that we think God said, "Parents, honor your children. Parents, honor your children and put them at the center of everything. Follow them around like they are in charge. Allow them to set the pace of your family. And whatever they want to do, allow them to do it." But that's not what Paul said. But that's kind of what happens when we put kids in the center of our family, that we allow them to dictate the pace of our lives, and either their desires are dictating the pace of our family and the pace of our life and eliminating margin because they want to do everything because they don't really have the maturity to be able to know what is wise and what isn't and how much is too much and what does family margin look like, or it's our own desire for our kids to put them at the center and want to just cater to every one of their needs, that we begin to just run at such a pace that we don't want to say no to any opportunity because we want to put them at the center and make sure that they are getting everything that they possibly can. And we run them ragged, getting them involved in everything possible. But God commands children to honor their parents because parents are the center of the family. Now, technically, Jesus is the center of the family, but when it comes to the actual members of the family, parents are the center of the family. When God created the first family in Genesis chapter 1, there was a husband, and there was a wife, and there were no children, but we had a family. And what we see all through the Bible is that the marriage relationship is the nucleus of the family. Again, right here in Ephesians, Paul just spent 12 verses talking about what it means to be a husband and a wife. And we see all through the New Testament counsels to husbands and wives and marriage and how to have a good marriage and all of that. It's all through the New Testament. But when we come to counsel for families, we get 4 verses. Because again, the Bible is communicating to us the marriage relationship is the nucleus of the family. And I think the Bible would say, the Bible writers would tell us, that if we get the marriage relationship right, we have a real good shot at getting the family right. If we put first things first, get that in there first, everything's going to come together. And accordingly, the number one thing our children need from us is that mom and dad be the center of the family, not the other way around. Now, hear me clearly. I mean, children are to be loved and nurtured and included in the family, and they're to be supported and cherished and snuggled and all that. But a strong marriage is a key for a strong family. And it's what causes, really, kids to thrive. When the kids are able to look up, little Timmy and little Mary are able to look and see mom and dad love each other, they're committed to one another, they're a unified front, that gives them the security that they need that can never, ever come from putting them at the center of the family. And that's why children are commanded to obey and honor their parents and not the other way around. And when we keep mom and dad at the center of the relationship, at the heart of the family, it begins to create ballast. Weight below the waterline. Kim and I have worked really hard on this over our 20 years of parenting, and over many years and in a number of ways. We have told our two boys, basically, and we've said this specifically, but we love you guys. We're so glad you're a part of our family. You're equal members of our family. But mom and dad were a family before you came. Mom and dad will be a family after you leave. So try not to mess things up while you're here. The kids need to know that. Too many families become so focused on the kids and how the kids are doing and what the kids are doing that mom and dad just become like the kids' support team. Hey, you got this, I got that. Let's make sure we're supporting the kids, and let's just get, whatever the kids want to do. And then when the kids leave, then what happens? Mom and dad look at each other and they're like, who are you? I don't know you. I don't even know if I like you. And then, of course, the family falls apart. So Kim and I, we are all for supporting kids. We're all for driving them around and watching their sports games and cheering for them. We're the loudest cheer people on the sidelines. If you've been to a game, you know this. We love all of that. But our kids, our sons, need to know that mom and dad's relationship comes first. We are primary. They orbit around us. We don't orbit around them. So the kids, as they were growing up, Kim and I would never hesitate to take a trip away. Started when I think Luke was maybe 6 months old. We were off for a 5-day trip to go to a wedding. We're so thankful for Grandma Schubert and Grandma O and Aunt Dree, who are able to watch the kids as we go away either for a weekend getaway or 2 weeks out of the country. And we always come back strengthened to, a unified front. Our relationship is strong. We're ready to take on whatever, the family or the world's going to throw at us, because we are kind of unified in that. And we're shocked, because we talked to other parents who are shocked that we'll do that. And we've talked to parents who are like, you guys are going away without the kids? We haven't done that since we were married. And they have teenagers. And we're like, wow, that just never occurred to us that we wouldn't do that. And so mom and dad, I just want to ask you this question. Are you the center of your family? And what does that look like for you? It doesn't have to be trips away to make you the center of the family, but do your kids have the security of knowing that you have a strong, healthy relationship? Do you spend the time needed working on your marriage, your relationship, rather than just following the kids around? Do you make decisions for what your kids should be involved with, or what your family should do based on how will this affect us? How will this affect the margin, the little margin that we already have? And are we able to kind of take this on and remain strong and unified if we make a yes on this decision? The first important thing we have to get into the boat to create margin is this. Mom and dad, you are the center of the family, not the kids. And it's no different if you're a single parent. You are the leader, not the kids. And as we begin to get this right, then we will create the ballast we need to be able to lead our family through whatever storm comes. What's the second big thing? Number one, mom and dad are the center of the family. Number two, Paul continues in verse 4. He says this, fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. So Paul's instruction here is to fathers specifically, but by the context we could tell he's talking to parents. This applies to moms too. But dads tend to be the ones who exasperate their kids more than moms. And so Paul's counsel is to them. And he gives parents the purpose of parenting right here. Again, this is probably one of the only verses we're going to find in the New Testament that really kind of talks about this is your purpose, mom and dad. This is why God has given you children. And again, I mean, just the fact that this is the only thing that we get in all the New Testament just kind of makes it stand out as so ultimately important. That in light of the power of the resurrected Christ, as redeemed man and woman who God has brought together as a husband and wife, your purpose in having these children is first and foremost to bring them up in the training and in the instruction of the Lord. Fathers, don't exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and the instruction of the Lord. That's it. Fathers in that culture were apparently exasperating their children, as fathers tend to do. And so Paul says this needs to stop. In other translations, the Bible says, fathers, do not lead your children to anger. Don't lead them in a way that you're causing them to be angry or embittered or resentful against you. And in a world where domestic violence is commonplace and where children are suffering at the hands of their parents, this needs to be said loud and clear. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Do not lead them to bitterness, to anger. But more than just physical violence, we fathers have this way of leading our kids and pushing our kids to succeed and to strive and to stretch and to get better. That just also has a tendency to exasperate our children and to lead them to anger. And so we fathers, we need to be careful about how we lead our children so that we're not leading them to anger, not exasperating them. I said this before, but I learned a long time ago, well, not long, I learned it much later than I should have, that my kids, they don't need a coach, they need a cheerleader, right? And they don't always want the coach. That leads to exasperation. But more than just not leading them to anger, if Paul is writing to our culture, I think he would probably say something like, fathers, do not exhaust your children with all of the activity. Mothers, don't exhaust your children with all of the activity. And why would he say that? What would be the point of saying that? Because clearly the activity, there's nothing wrong with the activity unless it competes with or gets in the way of our primary goal. What is the primary goal? Paul says, instead, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and the instruction of the Lord. Parents, this is our main purpose right here. This is why we have children, primarily, to bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord, to lead out in their character and their spiritual development. Now, most of us would agree with that. I mean, most of us are like duh, of course. If I'm a Christian and I'm a parent, my role as a Christian parent is to bring my children up to know, love, and serve Jesus. We would all say that would be our goal, that our kids would grow up strong character, strong faith, ready to meet Jesus when he comes again. But again, if we're to step back and just look at how we spend our time, we may discover a far different goal is driving us. You know, for many of us, the spiritual things take priority until they conflict with something that may be more attractive, and then the spiritual things take a back seat. Now, there are lots of things that can compete with our goal of raising our kids to love and serve God, their instruction in the Lord. Let's just consider one. Again, I'm going to go into a very dangerous cultural pool here. But let's talk about sports, right? Sports. I love sports. I hope you know that. Both my boys play sports, love sports. But sports have really become the new cultural religion. Matter of fact, just a few months ago, the New York Times ran an article, and it was called Team Sports Are Taking Over Kids' Lives. And in the article, they quoted one frustrated parent who hadn't been able to take a family vacation for as long as he could remember. And this is what he says. He says, if your kid plays football, forget going anywhere in August. If your kid plays basketball, forget going anywhere during winter break. And if your kid plays baseball, forget spring break. He says, and heaven help the family who has a kid that might play 2 or 3 sports during different seasons. And I would add to that, heaven help the family who has 2 or 3 kids who play 2 or 3 different sports during different seasons. Yeah, just insanity. The Times article goes on to quote Dr. James Emory White. He's the pastor of Mecklenburg Community Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. He's got a great blog. I follow it. He's a very wise person, writes some good things. But in a sermon and later in a blog post, Dr. White pointed out that studies show the declining attendance in churches is attributed to the growing sports movement, because sports are competing with church. One of the primary ways that parents kind of partner with the church to kind of raise their kids. Parents were deciding, we just can't fit church in anymore because we have the sports. Now, as a Seventh-day Adventist church, we haven't seen that as much because, we kind of guard sports and try to keep it out of the Sabbath, competitive sports. So we haven't seen that as much. But for churches that have their worship services on Sunday, this has been a big issue, declining membership or attendance because of sports. And so Dr. White stands before his church a few months ago, and he says to parents, let's say this out loud in front of the mirror and see if we like it. I will do spiritual things for my child's sake until sports conflict, then sports win. I don't know a parent who would like to say that, but that's what a lot of parents are saying. Sometimes, or anytime, we allow something to compete with our primary role as parents in the spiritual development of our children. It's what we're actually saying is, I will prioritize the spiritual development of my child until blank conflicts, and then blank wins. And again, many parents seem to be driven by a fear that our kids are going to miss out on something, that our kids are going to fall behind something, that our kids aren't going to like us, or they're going to resent us because we may say no to something or put spiritual things first. And so we put those other things before our priority to bring them up in the training and the instruction of the Lord. And if we're not careful, if we don't really think this through, and if we're not intentional, we're going to end up raising kids who love us, kids who have great memories of their childhood and all the activities, but they're going to be into their 20s, and the sports are going to be gone, and they're no longer going to be a part of those activities, but neither will they be interested in spiritual things. That as parents, we seem to invest so much into our kids' lives in things that they will not use in their 20s. They're not going to be playing baseball and soccer in their 20s. And we're neglecting the very thing they're going to need most in their 20s, Jesus, and a relationship with Him, and seeing Him as the priority of our families. Are you putting the spiritual development of your children above every other competing activity? Please hear me. Again, I love sports. Anyone who knows me knows I love sports. My kids are involved in sports. I love to go and watch my kids play. This isn't about a choice between Jesus and sports or Jesus and activities, or at least it doesn't have to be. But if that choice comes, the question is, what wins? Really, where does soccer fall in comparison to my kids' eternity? Children, obey and honor your father and mother. That's the first thing. Mom and dad at the nucleus. We've got to get that in. Got to make sure that's a part of our family. Number two, we need to bring kids up in the training and instruction of the Lord. That can look very different for all of us, again, but we need to get it in, whether that looks like partnering with a church or praying with your kids or Christian school or Sabbath school or family worship or whatever that might look like. There's lots of different ways that we could incorporate leading our kids in spiritual development. I've been talking for a while here. Hopefully you're not getting too weary, because I just want to finish with one thing. I've asked a couple to come forward, a couple that I've kind of watched for the last 7 or 8 years, and I think they do a pretty good job of managing this, and I could have asked any number of you to come forward and kind of just talk about what this looks like in your life, but there's a kind of a rest of the story I wanted to share it with this particular couple, so I just want to ask Reggie and Amy to come on up. They're probably nervous, so just kind of clap for them and make them feel welcome. This is Reggie and Amy Carveth, if you don't know them. Mother and father of 4 children.
You just chose the couple that had the
Well,
most
you know,
kids, right?
so as we talk about family margin, I mean, you guys have 4 kids. You guys are busy. I mean, is margin, is that something that is feasible? Is this something that you see occasionally? I mean, is it realistic?
No, that's not.
Let's talk about it.
I think that it's a tension that we always have to manage. I think we have kind of an ebb and flow with that in our family, where I feel like sometimes we've got some margin, sometimes I feel like I can only do this for one more week, and then, you know, something's going to blow.
Slow down. Yeah.
But I think that that's the first step in being able to maintain that healthy margin, is just acknowledging that and saying, listen, we're at a really, everything's kind of tight right now. We're, you know, putting a lot of energy into this, but there's some downtime coming, and you know, just constantly managing that, because I think that it's never going to go away. I mean, and I hope by the time our last one's gone, the older 2 will be bringing me grandbabies home, so I'll be able to have a whole
They'll start all over
set
again.
attention
Wow.
to
Wow.
to manage.
That's a great way to put it, though. So it's not like constant, like, it's like easy, but it's like moments of just over-the-top busyness, but then bringing it back to stasis. And
Right, and just always being aware that that's something that has to be managed. Sorry.
That's good. Well, as I've watched your family, you know, it seems that you guys have a really strong marriage, and the kids seem to know that. I mean, you guys love your kids like nobody I know, and you really invest in them, but it seems to me from the outside looking in that you guys are kind of the center of the family. And is that so? And if so, what do you do to kind of maintain kind of the marriage being the core relationship?
Well, I think one of the things that, gosh, that's so loud. One of the things that we've always done in our marriage is that we kind of end and begin our day together. So we have always gone to bed at the same time and gotten up at the same time. And a lot of times, that doesn't sound like a big deal, because sometimes it really only gives us, you know, a few minutes together before we're both out, or, you know, sometimes it's just a few minutes in the morning, but it gives us a chance to just kind of connect about what's going on in the family. Sometimes it's the only few minutes that we have for me to just say, hey, let me fill you in on what happened yesterday, or how are we going to handle this. And so that's, I think, been huge for our marriage. And I'd love to say that we have this, you know, weekly date night and all that people talk about. And we don't always, but we can always look forward to having those little bits of time together.
And I think you were saying that in the morning you're actually praying together. And
Yes, we didn't always do that, but the last couple of years we've really tried to make that a real concerted effort to make that a really spiritual time in the morning as well, to have worship together.
connect
And
spiritually and
yes.
relationally. That's good. Anything else you're doing as a couple to kind of maintain the...
I think the other big thing is just having a united front as a couple. I mean, we definitely don't always agree. We're both kind of, you know, if you know us, we're both, you know, strong-willed, opinionated, firstborn children, kind of. So our kids definitely see us disagree and kind of, you know, go at it sometimes. But we always come full circle, and you know, we're in this together. They see us argue, but they see us apologize, and they see us, you know, pull together as a unit, and we don't throw each other under the bus. And, you know, mom and dad are together on this.
They can't work you against each other?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
All right.
They can try, but
And I'm sure they do.
Yeah, they usually get benched when they do that.
Okay. What about the raising them kind of spiritually, you know, raising them in the training and instruction of the Lord? What does that look like in the Carveth home?
You know, I'd say one thing is we really try to model. Amy touched on it a little bit. It's never going to be perfect. There's going to be times where you make mistakes, and you have to kind of come back and say, kids, sorry, we messed up. Either we made a bad decision with you or with each other. and we apologize, and this is the way we should have done it. So modeling is huge, and when things go right too, acknowledging that too with God, saying, "Hey, this is going great because we did A, B, and C, and we put God first." Occasionally I'll try to give them little insights and things I'm struggling with at work or just emotionally working through, so they can, when appropriate, they can kind of see how that works out in my life.
Okay. Anything else you're doing to kind of raise them spiritually?
As a family, we made the commitment early on that Sabbath was non-negotiable. For us, the week is crazy, hit or miss. We do worship. I'd love to say we do it every evening together, but the reality is maybe once a week, maybe twice if we're lucky. But Sabbath is our kind of margin spiritually and as a family to really, everybody knows that's family time. So, and it's worship time.
Oh, good. Now, I know that you guys have put this training, instruction of the Lord thing at the forefront of your family. You've made decisions on that, and I think it was about a year ago you shared a story about how you were kind of wooed up to Minnesota for this dream job that you wanted to take, and it's a job you really wanted, and you were kind of already mentally moved there, but because it wasn't going to work spiritually for your family, you didn't really see moving them there was going to grow them spiritually, but you wanted to stay here. You made a very difficult decision to not move and take that dream job, and that was about 2 years ago, and you've been kind of living with that decision for the last 2 years, but in the last few weeks, something's kind of changed, and it seems like God has been behind the scenes the whole time.
Yeah, it's amazing. A lot of people, friends and family included, thought we were crazy when we passed on that job. It was just a great opportunity. It would have been a ton of fun for me. And spiritually, we just didn't think it was the right thing. We visited some churches, and we thought this was the best place for our kids to grow spiritually right now in this season. And that job actually has come full circle, and I'll be starting that same job with the same company next week.
But right here.
Right here in Denver.
So you guys, that's awesome.
Not next week. In a week.
In a week, yeah. All right, fantastic. Well, Reggie and Amy, we just appreciate your willingness to come up here, be transparent. We know you're not perfect, but you're managing to maintain some margin, and thanks for sharing just what that looks like for you. So,
thanks Dave.
So I'm just wondering what might happen if we kind of got this right, whether single family or married couple, that we just said, you know what, we're going to prioritize margin in our families. We're going to get the first things in first, the most important things in first, create ballast way below the waterline. Mom, dad, center of the family, working on that relationship, not orbiting the kids, but the kids orbit you. And then number two, that we would kind of go for this whole goal of raising our kids in the instruction and training of the Lord. And again, what does that look like for you? What would it mean to take a next step in prioritizing your relationship? Does that mean reading a book together or changing the focus from the kids to you? I mean, what is that going to look like for a next step in terms of prioritizing mom and dad at the Nucleus? Or what is it going to look like for you to bring your kids up in the training and instruction of the Lord? I mean, what competing thing would you maybe need to stop doing? I remember when our kids were little, we realized the one influence in our family that was completely trying to shape them into a form other than what God would have for them was television. And we made a very difficult choice when the kids were little to say, we're not going to have television anymore. And that was scary and it was painful. But because it was our goal, it was the natural thing for us to do at that time. What does it mean starting for your kids as you bring them up? Does it mean family worship? Does it mean praying with the kids? Does it mean praying for the kids as a couple? Does it mean partnering with a Christian school, prioritizing Sabbath school here on Sabbath mornings? I mean, what does it look like for you to bring your kids up in the training and instruction of the Lord, and what would it take for you to take a next step? I want to encourage you to do whatever it takes to take that next step as we together seek to build margin in our families.